Grace to you all this morning and peace from God our Father and from our Lord and Savior Jesus the Christ. Amen. In the gospel reading for today, there's this really, to me anyway, and maybe you'll catch that idea too, there's this really interesting kind of contrast between two stories or two experiences in Jesus' life that seem to be stuck together in a way or combined meaningfully with the connection of the word Jerusalem. Right? And what intrigued me about it this time through reading these short verses, there are only like 5 verses that we have, was the contrast between the first half and the second half. So here's what I'm talking about more specifically. Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. Earlier in Luke's gospel, we have heard that Jesus has predicted his death twice and his resurrection as well at the same time. And then Luke tells us that Jesus set his face toward Jerusalem. Because as we saw later in our reading for today, as we saw, Jesus says that a prophet must die in Jerusalem. So we know that that's his intention, right? So he sets his face towards Jerusalem. And while he's on the way, and if you read through Luke's gospel, it takes him quite some time to get there. It's not like he made the quick trip, right? Because he spends lots of time en route healing people, teaching, continue to grow his disciples into men of understanding, to get his followers to gather around this message that he's preaching and trying to live out for them. But as he's on the way, some Pharisees come up to him who were generally not his friends. As a group, they were not very friendly towards Jesus. In Matthew's gospel, in this period in Jesus' life, as he's making his way towards Jerusalem, there's lots of controversy that happens between the Pharisees and Jesus. They're always going at one another, and as Jesus responds, his responses to the Pharisees get harsher and harsher. But in this morning's gospel reading from Luke, we see that the Pharisees say to Jesus, "Get away from here, because Herod wants to kill you." And we don't know what the Pharisees' motives are. Luke doesn't take the time to tell us what he understands their motives to be. Only that they warn Jesus that Herod, who is the political ruler of that area, nominally so though under the Romans, that Herod wants to get rid of Jesus because, as we'll remember perhaps, Herod also was the one responsible for the death of John the Baptist. So if Herod feels threatened, he's quick, as we know from history, to take care of those threats. And Jesus is now a threat to Herod. So the Pharisees come to warn Jesus off or to get rid of him, get him out of the way by telling him to move on quickly. In any case, Jesus' response to the Pharisees is really interesting, and even in a broader way, his response to Herod's threat, because he knows that Herod has the power to kill him, is even more interesting to me, because when the Pharisees bring him this warning, Jesus says to them, "You go tell that fox that I'm doing the work that I'm supposed to do, and that he nor nobody's going to stop me from doing that work. So he can talk as much as he wants, but I've got a goal here. I've got work to do, and I'm doing that work, and he can try and do whatever he wants, but I know what I'm about," right? That's Jesus' basic message. I know what I'm about, and nothing's going to stop me from making my way to Jerusalem, which is my destiny. Which, when you think about it, that's a pretty defiant response to somebody who had a lot of earthly power. He calls him a fox, and then he says, "I'm going to do what I need to do. And Herod can try and stop me, but I will not be swayed from my path." Right? So there's this, in this first half of the story of the reading from the gospel, we have this very determined Jesus who knows his purpose, who knows his path, and he's walking it. And nothing's going to divert him from that path. And then in the second half of the story, after Jesus mentions that he's on his way to Jerusalem, he goes into a lament. The second half of our reading for this morning is a lament where Jesus says, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, city that stones the prophets and kills those who are sent to it. How often I would have gathered you together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and yet you would not." Right? And in fact, we know, because we know the rest of the story, that everything that Jesus says will be fulfilled. That he will get to Jerusalem and he will be crucified because he will run up against the power of both the Roman state and the Jewish authorities of that time, and that they are already prepared to get him out of the way as a troublemaker, a rabble-rouser, and even a revolutionary. So his path is set. And yet one intention to get to Jerusalem he's absolutely determined on, but that other intention, how often I would have gathered you together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and yet you would not, seems to be unfulfilled. The intention to defy the oppressive power of Herod is clear in Jesus' mind, but the intention to gather God's people together underneath God's protection and love seems to be one that will not come to pass. And it makes me think, in a way, if Jesus brings this great intention to making his way to Jerusalem, he must bring that same intention to bringing the awareness of God's presence and love to God's people. But if Jesus can overcome Herod, how come he can't overcome us? If Jesus is so focused on what he must do, that even the threat of somebody with power doesn't sway him, his greater purpose is to bring this message and the reality of God's love into human existence, and yet that seems to be more uncertain. How often I would have gathered you together and you would not. Why couldn't Jesus do the same thing with the crowds, with the people, as Jesus does in relationship to Herod? This is how it's going to go, whether you like it or not. This is what's going to happen, and just try and stop me. Well, I think you're probably already a step ahead of me here in understanding that as Jesus defies Herod, he defies Herod out of a direct intention of his mission and ministry, of a total focus on what he needs to accomplish, and that because of that greater purpose, he will let nothing dissuade him from his path. However, to get people to fall in love with God is not something that you can force. Jesus has control over his own destiny, but how people respond to that ministry, he will not control. And I think we need to be a little clear about the distinction here, that Jesus as God could control that, but then what do we end up with, right? We don't end up with love. We end up with subservience. We end up with slavery, and God does not want that from God's people. That's pretty clear throughout the history of God in God's relationship with us, that God could force love, but never does, because then it's not love. In fact, the whole message of Jesus and this incarnation of God into human flesh is that love must and can only be persuasive and never coercive. Love cannot force, it always asks. Love cannot demand, it always invites. And so Jesus wants to gather God's people together. And yet, if we reject that gathering, God will not force us. Until some future day, Jesus says, when finally all of humanity perhaps will wake up and say, now I get it, right? Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord, who recognize God in their midst. So there are several messages I think that we can take from this. One of them certainly is that God invites us into relationship. Again, always, despite our sinfulness, God is always extending that invitation to us. The message I kind of don't want you to take away as a standalone learning is that, well, you see, Jesus was focused on his path and he moved ahead on it. He wouldn't let anything dissuade him from that path. So we should be like that. Right? We should be like that. We should just have our focus on something, and we should make that our goal. I don't want you to take that away, because then that separates you from the relationship of moving towards a goal in harmony with Jesus. If Jesus becomes simply example to us and not companion to us, I think we're setting ourselves up for failure. Isn't that great? Jesus moved towards his goal. We should move towards our goal too, whatever it is. No, I think the message here is rather one of, again, and maybe you're predicting this outcome, right? Anybody want to guess the next sentence I'm going to say? It's always and ever in our life of faith about relationships, right? About relationships. So, for instance, when Jesus is asked to sum up the 10 Commandments or all of the law, in fact, briefly, he says it's this. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. So Jesus doesn't say that all the law is summed up in set your eye on something and go get it. He says it's about relationship with God and one another. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. He says this is the first and the greatest commandment, that relationship that God has established with us is the most important relationship in our lives. And I would ask us, as we're on our Lenten journey then, as we do a little bit of a time assessment, how much time are we spending on that relationship, which is the most important? And you can ponder that for yourself. He says that's the most important, but then he says the second is like it. You shall love your neighbors as yourselves. Now, maybe to that first part, we could say, yes, that's great. Those are good words. And we certainly love God. And we know we need to work on it more, but we value that relationship. But to that second part, and your neighbor as yourselves, that's where we get a little hung up sometimes. Or at least I do. Because I'm not sure which one I'm supposed to love based on which one. If you know what I mean. Like, I think most days I'm pretty good at loving my neighbors. Most of them. I'm not talking about other drivers. I didn't even mention that, so I don't know why you went there. But there are days when I'm really not that good at loving myself, which becomes the benchmark for the other. Should I love my neighbors as much as I love myself? Is that a good measure? Or should I love myself as much as I love my neighbors? Should I love them both equally? I think the problem comes when we separate these two things out, right? Jesus said the whole commandment is this: love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself, that those two things are intimately connected together. That if I have this healthy, meaningful, life-giving relationship with God, then when I look at myself or my neighbors, I recognize in both my neighbors and myself one redeemed by the love of God, one counted worthy and valuable, and we're all the same. Just let that soak in a little bit. We're all the same in God's eyes. God values us all equally. And therefore, I am called to value myself in that relationship and to value others based on that relationship. I am called to value others and also myself. Now, that gives us enough to do, doesn't it? That'll keep you busy for a while, trying to balance all of that out and get all of that into your head and, more importantly, into your heart, so that it's not only a concept but a motivating factor for your behavior. Let's try it out a little bit together this morning, shall we? How about that man that killed all those people in New Zealand? You love him? Heck no! How could he do something like that? I'm willing to bet that not a single one of us sitting here this morning would ever entertain behaving that way. It's just so outside the realm of understanding. And yet, bear with me here, we are called to love him. To love him. Now, objections. Let me address them before you voice them, as far as I understand them, because I feel them myself. He did a horrible thing. He killed 50 people in this terribly vengeful, racist way. Not only did he do that, but he did it with the intention that it should go viral. He filmed it in the process of doing it. What kind of a lowlife would behave that way? These are all valid objections. I get the emotional response. It's mine too. And yet, what kind of a person would do something like this? Someone broken, someone out of relationship, someone so corrupted by whatever experiences they've had that the only way they could see to express themselves was to commit this violent and despicable act. Make a distinction with me. See, one of the phrases that comes back to me again and again from Jesus is that we're to be wise as serpents and gentle as doves. Am I giving you too much to deal with today? Right? Love your neighbors as yourselves. Love God above everything. Be wise as serpents, gentle as doves. Like, man, it's heavy responsibility. You got a whole week to work on it, and then you come back and we'll give you some more stuff to work on, okay? But I think that statement of Jesus, to be wise as serpents and gentle as doves, means that we're supposed to be smart. We do not condone this man's behavior in any sense. We do not think it's acceptable, that it doesn't bear serious consequences for him, which is why we live in a world of justice. And yet, is there not some part of us that sees this man as neighbor, and our hearts go out to him that he got so broken that this is how he lived that out? Does it also not become a warning to us to say, how is my relationship with God, myself, and my neighbor, that I would not be found in that same position, not just to that extent, but with that attitude? How often have I been caught being racist, or dismissive, or sexist, or opposed to people of different gender orientations, and written them off because I have failed to love? And it's at those moments in my own life where, looking back, I realize that that Jesus is waiting to gather me together, to gather us under God's divine wings. And my reaction sometimes is, you know what, God, I'd love to do that, but if that person's under your umbrella, I'm going to go find another place to find shelter. If they're in there, I don't want to be. And how often do we do that? See, we remember perhaps that when Jesus is challenged again about the commandments, he says, you have heard it said, you shall not kill. But I tell you, if you even look at another person with anger in your heart, you have broken the commandment. Because Jesus gets it. Sin is never a matter of being of degree. It's of being on one side of the line or another. And we're all on the wrong side. We are all saying, do not gather me. I enjoy my self-definition as over against others. I like being who I am and not them. And that's part of our brokenness. Now again, please don't misunderstand me. I don't think any of you would do what this man did in New Zealand. I pray to God that no one ever does that again, even as I realize the vulnerability of our world. But we can't be quick to condemn another for the sins we ourselves carry. And the impetus is not only to bring justice in a case like that, to make sure that we don't participate or perpetuate that view of our neighbors or ourselves. I want to read you a poem that caught my attention. Actually, last night as I was lying awake thinking about this, this poem jumped to my mind, and it's kind of interesting. Let me set it up for you a little bit. It's that idea that I'm trying to share with you about love being only persuasive and not coercive, and that Jesus' ministry is to be such an example and such a powerful example, even to death and life again, let's not forget, of God's love and presence, that we're so compelled by that example, right? We're so compelled by that witness that it changes and transforms us. And not just us, but the world in which we live. And the harsh reality, my sisters and brothers, is that sometimes that transformation happens through us. I say it's a harsh reality because it puts more of that responsibility on us, but it's a gracious responsibility. And to keep in mind that this desire that God has to gather us together under one umbrella will eventually be fulfilled, but it's a challenge because often we're the ones stepping out because of the ones we already find under the umbrella. This was a problem that Jesus had in his ministry, by the way. Those who were religiously proper said, "What's the matter with you? Look at the folks you're hanging around with. Those aren't the kind of people that a holy man should be spending time with." And Jesus' response was always, "These are exactly the kind of people that a holy man should be spending time with. Because these are the ones that don't know that God loves them. And y'all think you know." He said that to them too, right? "Y'all think you know, but you don't get it either if you're complaining about me hanging around with them." So here's the poem. Now this poem is written by Rumi. God is so cool. Rumi was a Muslim mystic, a Sufi, a Muslim mystic. And he writes this poem, What Jesus Runs Away From. What Jesus runs away from. The Son of Mary, Jesus, hurries up a slope as though a wild animal were chasing him. Someone following him asks, "Where are you going?" "No one is after you." Jesus keeps on, saying nothing, across 2 more fields. "Are you the one who says words over a dead person so that he wakes up?" "I am." "Did you not make the clay birds fly?" "Yes." "Who then could possibly cause you to run like this?" Jesus slows his pace. "I say the great name over the deaf and the blind. They are healed. Over a stony mountainside, and it tears its mantle down to the navel. Over non-existence, it comes into existence. But when I speak lovingly for hours, for days, with those who take human warmth and mock it, when I say the name to them, nothing happens. They remain rock, or turn to sand, where no plants can grow. Other diseases are ways for mercy to enter, but this non-responding breeds violence and coldness toward God. I am fleeing from that. As little by little air steals water, so praise dries up and evaporates with foolish people who refuse to change. Like a cold stone you sit on, a cynic steals body heat. He doesn't feel the sun. Jesus wasn't running from actual people. He was teaching in a new way. Christ is the population of the world and every object as well. There is no room for bitter hypocrisy. Why use bitter soup for healing when sweet water is everywhere? I think that's just a wonderful expression of this desire of Jesus to reach everyone, to reach us again today, to remind us that there's only one umbrella, only one God who seeks to gather us. and that God's methods are always those of loving persuasion and invitation. And may we continue to be transformed by this determination of Jesus to invite us all in, transformed in our view of ourselves and our view of our neighbors, so that through us, transformation might continue.